Hello. So, this is Kelsey, the occupational therapist. I'm here today to talk to you about teaching writing to kids who hate writing. Or I put quotes around it, air quotes around hate writing, because that might be what kids say. And one of the things that I'm going to delve into is what they might mean when they're saying that. Let me start by explaining what direction I'm coming at this question from, because as an occupational therapist, I am not a literacy expert, I'm not a dyslexia expert, and I'm not trying to speak in place of people who are. What I am is an expert on occupation, not in the sense of your job, but in the larger sense of the word. Someone's occupation is anything that occupies their time. That can be self-care tasks, household chores, sleep, work, school, hobbies, play. These things are all occupations in the sense of the definition that's at the root of the word occupational therapy. And a core consideration of occupational therapy, a thing that makes it unique, is that the things that occupy people's time are supposed to be meaningful. It's what they've chosen to spend their time on. That doesn't always completely correlate with fun or playing, because people still have to take showers, put on pants, wash their dishes, but these things are important to them for some reason. They're something that they've chosen, because there's almost always some other way to do life if you didn't choose to do it that way. People could take baths or wipe with a cleansing cloth if they didn't want to take a shower for some reason. People can wear skirts or shorts. People can use a dishwasher or buy paper plates. There's always other ways to do things that are people's occupation. So the ones that they have chosen to engage in are usually meaningful to them for some reason. So then a problem that I run into that's specific for occupational therapists who work with kids versus occupational therapists who work with adults is that their caregivers are the ones who are making all of the decisions for them, about them, but then the kids are the ones who have to live with it. What I mean is that usually, with rare exceptions, for the kids on my occupational therapy caseload, somewhere between 5 and 10 adults sat in a room at some point and decided that their handwriting wasn't good enough and maybe their literacy skills weren't on par with other kids their age, and so therefore they need special instruction to make them read better and write better. And then those 5 to 10 adults set goals like, by next year, this student will be able to handwrite 2 to 3 sentences in response to a prompt with a tripod grasp on the pencil within 1/8 inch of the baseline with appropriate sizing and spacing and correct letter formation in an age-appropriate amount of time. But if you ask the kid, it turns out that they do not actually give one crap. They do not give a crap about writing 2 to 3 sentences. They certainly don't care about whether or not the writing that they manage to produce is some specific set of millimeters away from the line. They may or may not care about how they're holding the pencil. They don't care about whether they're forming the letters from the top or the bottom or whatever arbitrary right way you think that they should. And if they've summoned up the mental energy to answer the prompt you've given them and do it by hand when all the other odds are stacked against them, they sure don't want you timing them to make sure that they aren't writing too slowly. So then I am somehow supposed to do occupational therapy, a unique therapy that can focus on what meaningfully occupies this child's time. And I'm somehow supposed to do it for something that's utterly meaningless to them at baseline. And realistically, they may actually hate it entirely. So I'm left asking myself a few questions when I realize this. And maybe some of these are questions that you've asked before too. Let's start here. What is the reason behind writing things? I don't mean what's the reason behind being able to read. I mean what's the reason behind needing to write. And handwriting and typing are the same in some ways, but different in some ways. Handwriting is a little bit easier to break down into its components. So let's start there, and then we'll expand it to just the concept of writing at all. When I think about overarching reasons to be able to handwrite things, to me, I can think of all the things I can think of fall into 3 categories. I can think about being able to write for necessity. The writing is the actual thing that must happen, such as filling out forms. I've gone to a doctor's office. I need to write my name on the sign-in sheet. I need to write my information on their forms. I need to write. I can think of being able to write because writing is a strengthening process to learn other things. I need to take notes while this lecturer speaks, or I need to write out words so that I can remember how the words are spelled. Being able to write because writing is the vehicle for learning something else. And then the third category that I can think of is writing for joy and love and emotional processing and passion. Being able to write because writing is a facet of self-expression, and expressing ourselves is something deeply and incredibly human. Identifying those three categories helps me take a step back out of the equation, because now instead of me trying to say, you need to write, and the child trying to say, I don't want to write, I don't like writing, that just leaves the child and I at odds. But if I can figure out what category it is that I'm trying to address, then the child and I can both look down the path together at what the actual end goals are. Are we talking about this child needs help to get to a literal, functional level of being physically capable of writing? Are they genuinely incapable of forming letters and writing them in a way that will hinder them from participating in normal life things someday? Things like filling out forms at the doctor's office or signing their name on paperwork. And as an aside, there are usually accommodations for those types of things. There are apps you can use to take a picture of the form and then fill it out digitally. You can sign almost anything digitally, but leaving that aside for now, assuming that some level of writing is necessary to just get by in a basic life in modern times. If we're talking about, well, this child needs help to be able to write so that they can take notes in classes and learn from their notes and practice their spelling and sentence writing, that's a different level of intervention that you're talking about. And those skills are going to have different levels of targeting them. And additionally, again, with the workarounds, it's an occupational therapist's default to come up with workarounds. There are different workarounds for those issues. An auditory learner might be totally unbothered by the fact that they aren't taking notes by hand. They could record lectures and then listen to them again later. Or dictate their sentences out loud to someone who writes them down for them. There's lots of ways around these types of things, but again, assuming that there could be a need for intervention in this second category, being able to write because writing is a way to learn. Although, if you think about how common it is for people's note-taking handwriting to actually be pretty poor and illegible, if somebody was grading me on my note-taking handwriting, they might not think that I passed the metrics that would be written in a child's IEP. But if we're talking about me writing things down for the sake of my body physically having gone through the process of making the motions of writing the letters, I'm still doing that. I'm still meeting that metric. Nobody has to be able to reread my notes for me to have encoded the sensory motor process of moving my hand as I wrote that word or those letters. And then the last category, does this child need help because they just don't love writing and we wish that they did? Well, it's really obvious that no amount of crunching them through the gears of the system, demanding that they write X by Y age, is going to cause love or artistry or joy. I always ask, does this child ever see caregivers or adults in their life writing things by hand? Do they see a purpose for it? A lot of, surprising amount of kids don't see their adults writing anything at all by hand ever that isn't academic. So I'm not talking about the teacher writing down on the board what their assignment is for the day. They know that their teacher isn't just doing that out of love and joy and affection. They're doing it because it's the means by which they have to convey school assignments. Does this child ever see caregivers or adults in their life write things for love, for fun, even for usefulness? I know that the every time I bring this up, people tell me grocery lists, but then I ask, well, first of all, does your child watch you make a grocery list? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Second of all, are you sure that you make a grocery list by hand? Because I type grocery lists in my phone. I tell my Alexa what we need on the grocery, um, and that's what my kids see modeled. They don't see me writing it. Then, to go even further, does the child have the literacy skills in place to support being able to get their thoughts out in text with a scribe, with speech to text, with typing, with predictive text, with handwriting? There's so many different accommodations and assistive technology at this point that it doesn't have to be just writing by hand. Does this child that we're talking about have any context for how writing can be part of a game, part of something silly, part of a shared joke, part of something a little like sneaky or bad in a fun way? Or is writing only for this child something that is utterly meaningless, that adults demand that they do while the adults don't have to do it, and they have to do it for hours a day? Next big question I'm left asking myself when I think about kids who hate writing. How does writing develop? Ideally speaking, if nothing at all goes wrong from start to finish over the course of all the years, what does a great path to learning writing look like? How much adult intervention and explicit teaching does it need versus how much, if any, of it is natural development? Well, this leads to another interesting foray into my world, the world of occupational therapy. Because it turns out that before the small muscles in the hands are able to develop to a coordinated point where they can control a pencil for writing, or even control fingers for typing, although that takes a little less finesse, the larger muscles in the arm need to develop. And for that to happen, the muscles, the joints at the wrist, the stabilizing ligaments at the wrist need to have developed and strengthened. And for that to happen, the elbow has to happen before the wrist, and before that, the shoulder has to happen before the elbow, and before that, the muscles of the trunk and core have to be developed enough to control all of this. All of it is connected, and all of it actually starts inward and progresses outward. Babies learn to wave their whole entire arm around and are just like entertained by the fact that they've just moved their whole entire arm at the shoulder. They learn that before they learn how to coordinate the movements of their fingers to pick something up. And they learn how to pick something up with their whole hand moving as one big clumsy unit before they learn how to pinch things to pick them up with just an index finger and thumb. Human bodies start inward and develop outward, and the skills for fine motor activities like writing are no different. And running in parallel with the development of motor skills at all, in a healthy system, we also get the development of sensory processing. These things run in parallel. They're like a feedback loop into one another. A baby can't know that they're successfully picking up the item that they're reaching for unless they can visually process the sight of the item that they want, process with their sense of touch that they've made contact with the item, bear the weight of it as they lift it, and they're feeling that with their inner body sense, and so on. The sensory processing and the motor skills developing are like intensely intertwined. That also means that if sensory processing in a particular child is disorganized or dysfunctional, that will impact the way that motor skills develop. And if big body motor skills are underdeveloped, gross motor, then the small body motor skills, the fine motor, the finger movements to control a pencil and so on, are trying to build on a foundation that doesn't exist or has big gaps in it. And obviously, building on a foundation with big gaps in it tends to be unsuccessful, if not catastrophic. All of that leaves us with a few different venues to start with kids who hate writing. We can understand the reasons why they feel that way. They've been forced into a skill they weren't ready for, maybe at an age before they would have become naturally ready for it, or maybe due to a disability that meant that they would have always needed some extra help or a different means of learning than the norm. And often, for at least some amount of time, these kids didn't have any help or accommodations. Sometimes we catch them right early on, right away, right in kindergarten, but a lot of times we don't notice until later on whenever the deficit becomes so great that it's obvious that something is going on and that they're going to need help. But that means that during that amount of time, they didn't have anyone in their life to tell them, hey, you're not bad or wrong for not getting this. Everyone does things a little differently. They might have received overt messaging about being lazy or bad or not trying their hardest or not paying attention. They might not have received that overt messaging but still picked it up if the kids around them were getting accolades and awards and praise for doing such a good job at things that didn't come naturally to this kid. By the time that children come to me in my job as an occupational therapist, they often feel extremely threatened by writing. Because that's what they mean. Usually when they say they hate it, they mean that it feels like a threat to their body, their nervous system. They mean that it feels terrifying and impossible. The words that kids use to try to describe this might be, this is boring, this is dumb, this is stupid, or this is anxious, I am anxious, this is scary, this is too hard, I'm just not good at it. Sometimes the difference in the emotion that they're identifying, whether they're more likely to identify anger or whether they're more likely to identify fear, often the difference is drawn along the lines of the gender that they are or that adults are treating them as. But underneath it is the very real fact that because of their history, because of a potential disability, because they have no connection of meaningful joy or love or art to writing, it feels like a threat to them. And their body, just like everybody's body, is wired to protect itself from threat. Their brain is wired to run away from or avoid or fight a threat. And this is a threat. But now we know. We know that the sensory processing supports the writing. We know that the gross motor playing supports the writing. We know that core strengthening and upper arm strengthening and joint strengthening, all of that supports the physical, literal capacity for writing. And we know that occupational meaning supports the writing. It supports the emotional, heart-connected side to wanting to write. Because if we're talking about writing as itself, I've already touched on the fact that there's, especially in this modern world, there are a million accommodations and adaptations for that. If we're talking about writing as a vehicle, we can make accommodations and adaptations for that. But if we're talking about simply writing because we love it, writing because we are human and we're wired to create because words are a paintbrush that we can use to color the world around us, then we have to bring more joy and play into writing to begin with. And joy and delight and play are the opposites of hate and loathing and fear and boredom. I personally was a hyperlexic little kid. I taught myself to read when I was 2. I was a hypergraphic little kid. I wrote excessively and extensively. I would read and reread books that I loved, and then I would write just plagiarized but absolutely terrible like rip-off versions of them where I stole the entire plot, changed the characters' names, and wrote everything that with like tweaks to the plot that I could think of. And I delighted in that because I felt like I was writing real books, chapter books, and I was so proud of them. I would write book reviews of books just because I loved them. I wrote down the plots of my favorite movies. I wrote poems and songs and screenplays and stories. I wrote scavenger hunts for my little brothers. I wrote comics. I wrote down lists of my stuffed animals' names. I wrote captions on photos that I took with our point-and-shoot digital camera. I invented a greeting card business, and I wrote cards for every holiday that I could think of. I wrote cheesy inspirational stories because I was plagiarizing Chicken Soup for the Soul or Guideposts magazine or the type of forwarded emails you get from your grandma. I wrote notes to my parents and my teachers and my classmates. Throughout all of high school, I carried around a notebook with me at all times so I could write down funny things my classmates said and angsty teenage poetry and song lyrics that felt profound to me when I was 15. I wrote things by hand. I typed things in Microsoft Word. I made PowerPoint presentations with clip art moving around and I typed captions on each slide. I wrote things in video games. I drew charts and bullet point lists and pirate treasure maps and comic books and all sorts of just little kid nonsense. All of it driven by the fact that it was deeply, intensely, occupationally meaningful to me. And it was the seeds of all the writing I do for love today. Now, obviously, we are talking about kids who are having a wildly different experience of their childhood than me. The physical experience of writing might be hard, might be terrible, might be painful for them. And all of the feedback they've ever gotten from others and from their own self, from their lived experience, is about how their handwriting is bad and illegible and their spelling is wrong. And their thoughts are not becoming the delightful mountain of paper ideas that littered my entire childhood. Their thoughts are getting stuck in the attempt to translate them out of their brain and through their hands. Or their thoughts are channeling into some other delight-bringing childhood pursuit, like building amazing things in Minecraft, or playing a sport, or knowing everything there is to know about Pokemon. But when I think about the reason why I would passionately, as a child, write even on assigned things, even on boring school assignments, like write a sentence with each spelling word, and I was filled with passion and I would go out of my way to write an entire cohesive story out of all the spelling words. Or we would have to learn about some biographical character and write a few sentences about them. And I would write an imaginative retelling of some important event in that character's life. Because I already knew that writing was and could be occupationally meaningful. So even when adults were foisting it on me in some medium that I was uninterested in, I had 100 other examples of times that writing was a delight, and that supported the one time I was having to do it on demand. Our kids, the kids we're talking about, the kids who hate writing, they have the opposite ratio. Maybe one time they've ever felt delighted in what they wrote, compared to 100 times that they're forced to do it by teachers, therapists, everyone in their life. And those 100 times feel awful. They far drown out the one. I have never, in my OT practice, felt like making a kid do a worksheet, adding one more time to the 100, is going to be helpful. Even if the other 100 times throughout the week they don't have me there to coach them on handwriting, but this one time with me they do have me there to coach them, I don't think that the amount of help from the coaching will outweigh how much I'm just adding drudgery to drudgery. But if we play together in sensory-rich, child-led, exploratory ways that support sensory processing, gross motor skills, core strengthening, wrist, elbow, and shoulder strengthening, all of that must come before the writing comes anyway. And if, in our play, I model, me the adult, I model freely and joyfully the idea that writing can be used as a medium for scavenger hunts and pirate treasure maps and screenplays and lists of their favorite Pokemon. And if in our play, I make sure that paper and markers are out everywhere in the room, and whiteboards and markers are close by, and anytime they start to tell me anything that I could model with rapt interest, ooh, I want to remember this, let me write it down, and then I grab a paper and begin note-taking. I see a shift happen. It is gradual, because to them it has always been threatening. It has only ever been academic, demanded, forced, instructed, but I see them start to realize that I'm writing something for something they resonate with. And when something resonates with children, when it means something to children, then they take it and they explore it in their play. I know that this is all very, very theoretical and kind of an overarching thinking talk, a theory talk, with very little about specific go out and do this next Tuesday type of strategies. But I think that the spheres are so different sometimes between teaching and tutoring and occupationally therapizing and speech therapizing and parenting or whoever else might be listening to a video like this. But I think that the mindset can be the same. The theory can be the same. It can be rooted in showing children that writing can be meaningful to their lives and enabling that joyfully whenever possible. And in building those important foundations first before we try to get to the higher level stuff. All of that starts with just knowing. All of that starts with when the mindset shift is already there. So now you know, now we can try to do something differently. Now we can try to show kids how writing can be for love and for joy by modeling the ways that it is for you. And if you don't know how it is those things for you, then maybe that's an area that you need to play in too.